So when you hear the phrase safe and sealed, which destination comes to your mind? If you answered North Korea, I'm sorry to say you are incorrect. The correct answer is actually Thailand. Now I'm going to get into what safe and sealed means in just a second, but for now I think we should start sort of at the beginning, because I think a lot of you who have found this video and who are watching this video might not understand the backstory behind Thailand's current entry ban. So essentially, I guess it was probably around the end of March, Thailand closed its borders and closed its airspace to all scheduled flights. And since then, foreigners have essentially been banned from entering. Now, there have been a few exceptions. So starting in July, there were several groups of foreigners who were permitted conditional entry, assuming they jumped through a lot of hoops, among them receiving a certificate of entry from a Thai mission abroad, submitting to several PCR tests, one before arrival, one after arrival, and I think one before they are allowed to exit the alternative state quarantine that they call it. And then of course they have to have a valid reason for entry. So in most cases this is employment or business related things, but Thailand has also started accepting the entry of certain students, namely university and graduate students. And then some medical tourists as well, although that's a little bit nebulous because certain types of medical tourists have been permitted entry and certain types have been denied. So essentially, Thailand, which prior to COVID-19 was one of the premier tourist destinations in the world and one of the countries whose economies depended most on tourism, has been off limits to tourists for almost 6 months now, which would have seemed inconceivable back then. So why does a country where 20% of the direct economy comes from tourism and a significantly greater margin than that sort of cascades down from monies received by tourists, why have they not devised an exit strategy, at least not one better than safe and sealed? So I think the first thing we have to look at is that in spite of Thailand's, I don't want to say reputation, I don't want to demean the kingdom, I love Thailand, but for those of you who have lived in Thailand, and I lived in Thailand for a couple years up until not so distantly in the past, it is kind of surprising that Thailand has handled COVID as well as it has. I think they've had a little over 3,000 cases, around 50 deaths. Now, of course, these are the official numbers, and for those of you who have lived in Thailand or spent a lot of time there, you know that you can't always trust official things in Thailand. But I would say that it's pretty clear that Thailand has handled COVID-19 better than most countries in the world. Unfortunately, the problem with this is that the government has basically set a benchmark of 0 infections equals success, and anything else is failure. And that's really bad for a lot of reasons. So the first reason it's bad is because it's not sustainable. As we've seen in Vietnam, New Zealand, South Korea, Australia's Victoria State, the virus is going to come back at some point. And because it's mutated to a more contagious but less deadly strain since the first one that swept through Thailand, it's probably going to come back in a pretty big way. So by setting this benchmark of success is 0 infections and anything else is failure, the government is setting itself up for failure, which in the particular case of Thailand is very dangerous because, of course, they have the student protests going on right now. There have been questions about the legitimacy of the government for basically its entire existence since General Prayut seized power in 2014, and the election that occurred a couple of years ago was generally regarded not to be free and fair. So right now, I think the entire legitimacy of his government and the fact that more people, at least tentatively, are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt than not, is this idea that he has done a good job on COVID-19. And now where this relates to tourism in particular, you know, every country in the world has to strike a balance between economic concerns and health ones. This idea that some people, just Cinderella, have that you cannot do anything to address the economy until the virus is completely eliminated, that's fantasy, that's fairy tale land, it's not reality. And unfortunately though, in Thailand, they still are in the very early stages of those conversations and weighing those considerations. Now the good news is it does seem like they're moving in that direction. So those of you who have been following the Thailand immigration situation for a long time will know that during the months of May and June, the kingdom was looking at establishing travel bubbles that ended up deflating in Thailand, as they have everywhere else, because there was a second surge of coronavirus in many countries in July. But now I think, first of all, that this surge is starting to disintegrate, and largely without the draconian lockdowns we all thought were necessary back in the spring. And secondly, that the economic reality is more on the wall for Thailand. I think this is pushing the government to be more creative and to be more open. Now that's the good news. The bad news is that this openness is taking a ridiculous form. Enter safe and sealed. So as I mentioned in the intro to this video, it really does sound like a North Korean prison camp. And it's not, but so the basic idea of safe and sealed is this. So first of all, it would be limited to European and Asian tourists within a 6-hour direct flight of Thailand, which is problematic from the beginning, of course, because nowhere in mainland Europe, and I don't even think the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, are only 6 hours away by plane from Thailand. So this is sort of dead on arrival. But even if we move past that, the idea is that tourists who participate in this scheme would fly directly to a Thai island. So I think Phuket is the one that's going to start this off on October 1st, and then it could be expanded to Samui and Phang Ngan and Phi Phi if that works. But at any rate, the idea would be that they would arrive directly to the island, they would get a PCR test before they leave, they would get a PCR test after they arrive, they would spend 14 days in hotel quarantine, and then at that point they would be free to go out into the island wherever they arrived at and explore at their leisure. Now if they wanted to go elsewhere in the kingdom, they would need to basically do an island quarantine of not leaving that island for an additional 7 days. So to zoom out on this, it's if you want to travel to Thailand in October under the safe and sealed arrangement, assuming you can test negative for coronavirus at least twice, and assuming you're willing to stay in a villa quarantine for 14 days, the soonest you can begin exploring the country freely, as any Thai person would, is 21 days, which I think for retirees and people with Thai families and people who might want to stay 21 months or 21 years is a pretty good trade-off. But for normal travelers, especially normal travelers that now have probably a dozen countries at least that they can go without any quarantine or testing protocols, this is not going to be a popular option. I mean, I think the number of people who are going to take Thailand up on this, if it remains intact, are probably going to be in the dozens or the hundreds, and not the thousands or the millions that they're hoping. Now, what I do hope happens over the next month, because I guess probably they're not going to finalize plans for this until the last minute, as nothing does in Thailand. I think they're probably going to realize they need to compromise. I think that, let's just say, if they were to officially roll this policy out as it stands on September 1st, by September 15th, it would become very clear that almost no one is going to take them up on this. So what do I think is going to happen? So I think the first thing that they're definitely going to get rid of is this second 7-day island quarantine. I think that there will be some sort of quarantine in place. In my opinion, if you're testing before departure and after arrival, it should just be one 7-day period after you arrive in the kingdom, and then you can explore as you'd like. But more likely, it's probably going to be a 14-day quarantine after you arrive in Thailand, and then you're free, which again, I don't think that'll get too many takers, but I think that removing this 7-day second quarantine will move a lot of people who are on the fence off it. So I think that's the first thing that's going to happen. I think the second thing that's going to happen is I don't think it's just going to be Phuket, because I think that I don't know. I've just always felt that Phuket is an overrated place that has limited appeal, and I don't know how many people are going to be willing to sit in prison in Phuket in order to maybe one day explore the rest of Thailand. Because here's the other big problem, going back to problems in a second with this villa quarantine, or the safe and sealed rather. So let's say you quarantine for 14 days inside a resort in Phuket, and on day 13 it's revealed that somebody else staying in that resort is positive. Does that mean that you need to get another test and quarantine inside the hotel for 14 more days? Let's say you make it to the 14 days and you're on Phuket and you're there for 6 days and you're about to fly to Chiang Mai on the 7th day, and it's revealed that there is some kind of outbreak on the island. Does that mean that you have to go back into villa quarantine and stay for 14 days? Does that mean that you have to stay for 7 more days on Phuket or indefinitely until the outbreak is suppressed? These are real questions, and they're ones that I would almost guarantee the people on the committees deciding these have not considered at all, because again, I lived in Thailand, I know how it works. So I guess to wrap this up, it has been a little bit convoluted and I apologize for that, but to wrap this up, I do think that we will see some kind of opening of Thailand to tourists from October 1st. I do think it will be based on the safe and sealed system. I really hope they rebrand it because it does sound like a North Korean prison camp. But I don't think it will be the plan as presented. I think they're going to realize once they see low bookings throughout the month of September that they're going to have to loosen requirements a little bit. And what I imagine it will be is you need to fly into Thailand, probably not just Phuket. You need to stay in quarantine in a hotel for 14 days. And then, assuming you jump through all those hoops, I do think you'll be able to travel freely. I think this will mostly be attracting digital nomads and expats and probably, unfortunately, some sexpats too. And I think still that it will be thousands of people in the best case scenario and not the millions that Kun Pipat and Kun Anutin are hoping. But I do think that the ball is going to start rolling, because the reality is that unlike New Zealand, which has tourism as a huge portion of its economy, Thailand does not have these incredibly full government coffers that it can pull from while it keeps the country locked down until the entire planet is vaccinated. And I think reality always wins out in every situation, but in particular when it comes to economics. And the economic reality is that Thailand is nothing without tourism.